All right, it's time for an update and forecast on the park fire. I would say the park fire yesterday was not only the most active wildfire I've seen this year, but it quite possibly could have been the most active wildfire I've ever seen. I mean, if you look at the acreage burned in about 24 hours, it burned over 100,000 acres. And then if you go to the fire perimeter, keep in mind this actually isn't even the current fire perimeter, so it's closer to what happened over a 24-hour time period. That's about 24 miles worth of growth right there I believe this started 2 afternoons ago. So what we're going to do throughout the course of this video is we're going to kind of look at the past, figure out what happened yesterday, then we're going to look at what the current conditions look like on the fire, and then we're going to look at the weather forecast for this afternoon. Now before we get into that, the first thing I should say is if you are in one of these areas that's in red around the fire, that's where there's an evacuation order. If you're in the yellow, that's where it's an evacuation warning. So, warning, you should be ready to go. Honestly, anybody who lives in high fire danger areas in California should just be ready to go all fire season. And then order, once that's issued, you should just get out of there as quickly as possible. So the fire yesterday kind of split in two. Half of it went off to the north, which is burning into the area where there's not as many structures, and then the north or the southeastern section of the fire was extremely active. So I was watching the southeastern side of the fire the most closely, and that's where we saw a lot of the air attack yesterday. It actually looks like that's where a lot of the air attack still is, around that southern side of the fire. The reason for that is that's where the largest amount of structures are. So if you look to the southwest of the fire, that's Chico, and then you have Paradise, and then if we zoom in closer towards the fire, that's where we have, Forest Ranch is that cluster of structures there. And I will say the fire perimeter looks to have held outside of Forest Ranch, so that's good news there. As of this fire perimeter, it shows that it did go through Lower Cohasset, and then the most recent perimeter, which is actually on the Watch Duty Up website. I think you'll be able to see it better if I turn off the hotspots. Actually does, let's turn off the aircraft while we're at it. That can be a little distracting. So that's that new patch that you see right there. So that finger that extends right around Forest Ranch, I believe what happened overnight is we had the winds shift to a more southwesterly direction, and that helped push that back into the fire. But we also did see on the cameras yesterday some activity just to the east of Cohasset, and then I believe it just kind of basically moved through there. Now the main thing that I want to emphasize, and you can read it in the description of this video as well, is just because the fire perimeter is now over Cohasset, you can see all of those structures right there, it doesn't mean that all of those structures are destroyed. So, on a fire, you can have areas where there's low severity burning, high severity burning. You can have unburned islands. Maybe there's areas in here where they did a lot of fuel preparation and really cleaned out their gutters, really cleaned the fuels around their house, created that defensible space, and maybe the fire passed around them but didn't actually burn through. Now I will say though, when we look at the CAL FIRE numbers, well, personnel, it's amazing how many resources they've got on this fire in such a short period of time, over 1,600 personnel. We're seeing, I would say, the most aircraft I've ever seen on a fire yesterday afternoon. They did update the structures number, and it does look like we now have 134 structures destroyed. So that's some new information that we're dealing with there. Most of that, I'd imagine, is in the Cohasset area because, again, it does look like the fire stayed to the west of Forest Ranch. So let's actually look at what happened yesterday because this is where a lot of the action was. So you could see Chico down here. Chico, Paradise. This is where the southeastern portion of the fire was. And then notice on Watch Duty, that little finger that extends right there. You see where that red is kind of a darker shade? That is what was rushing up this canyon right here. And I believe that's called Big Chico Creek. And then here you see Forest Ranch. And along the fire, I did hear 1 or 2 reports that it was able to jump over 32, but it sounds like they got some retardant drops on it and actually kept it to the west of 32. The most recent information that I have to go off of, that's what we are going to stick with right now that it is still to the west of 32. Very challenging weather forecast this afternoon, though, so we're going to have to watch that closely. But basically, yesterday afternoon, that finger that you see right there was rushing up Big Chico Creek, pushed very close to Forest Ranch, but as of right now, it looks like we've actually kind of pushed past that, and that actually could be good news for Forest Ranch at this point, because now I'll show the weather forecast in a second. It's mostly south winds both today and tomorrow, so that's going to continue to push the fire away from Forest Ranch. So it was a very close call there, so that's where maybe our good news is. The bad news is certainly what happened in Cohasset, but again, I'm not on the ground. We don't know exactly how bad the damage is in there, but CAL FIRE did say 134 structures have now been destroyed. So I've been talking about the finger that extended up here. That was the most active portion of the fire yesterday. We can actually see what that looked like right here, where you notice there's a little rotation to it. I wouldn't get too worked up about calling this a fire tornado or anything like that. I would say it's a rotating column. It happens when there's kind of two different things going on. So one aspect, I learned this from Neil LaRoe. He's one of the top fire tornado experts in the world. I've actually gotten to go to a couple fires with him, and he's the one who said, hey, don't worry about calling it fire tornadoes. It's a rotating column. We're more here to understand than to put big words on things. That's like bomb cyclone or other terms like that. So basically what happens here is you get so much rising motion that you're going to get air rushing in to take the place of that rising air. And then what's going to happen is if some of that air rushes in a little bit faster from one side than the other, then you're going to start to get this rotation around the plume. And then once you get a little momentum on that, it's just going to spin faster and faster. Now, the other thing that's kind of going on, and this was something else that Neil taught me, is you can also almost think of it like if you have, like in a creek or a river, and you have a rock blocking the flow of the river. So you could think of this rock as all of the air that's rising on this plume right here, because it heats up, it becomes less dense, and then it rises. And then you have a prevailing flow, which yesterday was from the south. So that's going to be coming kind of around that rock. And if you've ever seen a river, a lot of times behind the rock, that's where you get those little kind of whirlpool things right there. And that's also sort of what's happening in the smoke plume. So that's basically our little explanation of why that's rotating right there, and kind of maybe addressing some of the fire tornado talk you've maybe heard happening. But basically what I'm trying to point out is that's the canyon that we were just looking at on this map right here. There's the camera. That's Platte Mountain. Yesterday evening was looking down this canyon. So from this view, Forest Ranch is going to be on the eastern side of the fire right here. And then the up canyon winds basically push this past where we have this camera, and then it continues to go. Now, I will say, looking at the camera right now, while it was certainly still active as we got into the nighttime hours because conditions remained very hot, dry, windy, you can see how much unburnt fuel is in this area. The camera this morning looks like it has finally calmed down a little bit. And I should just point out the fire history in this area. And maybe I should just turn on MODIS and VIIRS, because I think this is more accurate for where the fire perimeter is. Now you can see that does unfortunately cover Cohasset, but it doesn't look like it has extended any further over Forest Ranch. And then obviously lots of growth towards the north. Most of the growth that I'm expecting today is going to be towards the north, because you notice there's not as many of those orange dots, so structures in that area. So they're concentrating the resources down on the southern edge of this fire where there's more risk involved. And then we're looking at fire history. So we did have a little fire history on the northern side right here, but it doesn't seem to be helping us at all. You see the 2013 deer fire, that I almost didn't see it at first because the perimeter just went right through that. So fuels obviously grew back since 2013. That didn't help us out. And it doesn't look like the 2008 mill fire is going to help us out either. So that's just going to keep going up there. That's where the term acreage burned can be somewhat misleading, though, is because a lot of this area will actually be benefited by wildfire. This is area that's supposed to burn, and it hasn't burned in decades. You can see we don't have the fire history there. And a lot of the plants and even some animals in California require wildfire in order to survive and reproduce. So as this fire comes through and clears it out, like one example is it could take out a lot of the brush, and then you get those new little seedlings popping up, and the deer populations actually like that a lot more. And it just clears out fuel, so then there's less just continuing to accumulate, leading to much more extreme wildfires in the future. You get that kind of shorter fire return interval, which leads to less intense fires. Now, one thing that's a little alarming, though, is we don't see very much, if any, fire history between the Park Fire and, let's say, the Dixie Fire or the Camp Fire or the North Complex, way towards the east over here. That all in there where you see that green, that's going to be fuels that haven't burnt in. I put my fire history from 2000 to the present because anything more than 20 years is not going to really help you out. And it seems like on the northern side of this fire, anything within 10 years doesn't really help you out either. So there's a lot of unburnt fuel here, and we are still seeing some heat detections on this fire. So maybe that's where we should go next. Although maybe I'll just one more thing, kind of wrapping up what happened yesterday. Again, the fire perimeter does now extend over Cohasset. One thing I do want to show that could maybe be some silver lining, I try to pull it out of everywhere, is I believe this is the Cohasset camera last night. And watch as this fire comes through. You notice, like, after it comes through, a lot of these trees actually aren't burned. You notice those trees aren't torching, it's just kind of creeping along the ground. So again, trees have a better ability to survive than structures do because trees have more moisture in them, whereas structures, that's kind of like a dead fuel. So it's a lot drier, especially if you have pine needles on your roof or in your gutters or around the base of your house. But the reason I wanted to show this, and why it could, even though it looks pretty scary, could possibly be a silver lining, is if you have a house and you did a bunch of defensible space around it, it's not that it's just a giant wall of fire that comes through and destroys everything. You see how these trees are all still standing? So hopefully that's some of the structures in Cohasset, because, I mean, that looks about as alarming as a fire could be, and that's kind of how it was looking yesterday evening when we were following it live. So that's kind of wrapping up what happened yesterday. The last thing that we can look at is just the satellite imagery. You can see, I wanted to show this as well just to show how active it was yesterday and how it kind of split in two. That northern end pushed up, and then that southeastern edge of the fire became very active. I'll just close that one out. The reason I wanted to show that, though, is we can compare that to what it looks like now. And you notice it doesn't look nearly as active right now. We still had some orange showing up last night, but you're not seeing that much heat coming off of the fire right now. There's certainly still some smoke, as you'd expect, but I mean, that's definitely an improvement on that, which is yesterday. Now again, I am recording this around 9:30 this morning, and your fire activity does tend to pick up in the afternoons, and this afternoon's forecast does look very challenging. So we'll most likely see activity pick up, but it at least looks good that it's not just continuing to rip right now. For example, that southeastern side of the fire right there, which was the most active part of the fire yesterday, we could take a look at that from the Bald Mountain Butte camera. So that's the camera. It's going to be looking at that kind of finger of the fire. That was basically that rotating column that we looked at in that one video. Here's what it's looked like over the last hour. I mean, yeah, I shouldn't downplay it too much. That's very active for 9:30 in the morning. And then you're starting to see it kind of push up. See those little punches right there? What I'm waiting for is when one of those really starts to push up. That's when it kind of, a lot of times you can have a little inversion overnight, and then once it breaks through that, then you start seeing the winds pick up, and then the fire becomes a lot more active. But that definitely looks better than it did yesterday afternoon, although, again, certainly more active than it should be at 9:30 in the morning. So there's our numbers. I guess that kind of updates us on what happened in the past, what it currently looks like. Now we can get into the weather forecast, because that's going to determine what happens on this fire throughout the day today. And unfortunately, the weather forecast actually looks more challenging, I would say, than yesterday. Although, I mean, you could just say similar. There's a red flag warning in place. That's in place through 11 p.m. Friday. Southerly winds 10 to 20 miles per hour, gusts up to 30. That's the reason I said it looks potentially worse than yesterday. As yesterday, the forecast was for gusts to 25 miles per hour. Now 30. It's not that big of a difference. And it's certainly 25 or 30 is certainly strong enough to lead to that growth towards the north. Low daytime relative humidity, 10 to 20%. That's about as dry as you're ever really going to see. And then poor to moderate nighttime relative humidity recoveries. So the reason that's important is because when it stays dry overnight, that allows the fire activity to continue overnight instead of the moisture going into the fuels and the fire really calming down. Now, with that being said, I mean, the fire certainly looks a lot calmer right now than it did yesterday morning. So it seems like we have seen conditions somewhat improve. So next, I just did the forecast for Forest Ranch. Figure that's an area that's close to where the fire is still showing some activity. So this is going to be today. That's tonight. That's tomorrow. And then that's tomorrow night over there. So looking at today, it looks like our temperatures do go up around 90 again. And then you see those wind gusts pick up in the afternoon. So your purples, your sustained winds. Those are your wind gusts. And for some reason, the National Weather Service website always undercalls the winds on this chart. I don't know what it is about this chart. But when it shows, I'll show another website for focusing on the winds. For this one, mostly look at the temperatures. 90 today, relative humidity dropping into the teens. Stays pretty dry overnight, although we do see a little recovery. Overall, you'd call that a poor recovery, though. And then tomorrow, it does look like there's a cool down expected by as much as 10 degrees. And then a little bit more moisture starts to move in. So right there, you'd say the forecast for Saturday looks a lot better than the forecast for Friday. And then from this map, you would say, oh, we're also not going to see those strong winds in the afternoon. But that's also why I don't really trust this website for winds. I trust windy.com for winds. That's probably why it's named what it is. So just looking at this point right here, here's Chico, here's Paradise. I tried to pick somewhere that would be roughly where we're seeing some of the activity on this fire right now. And then let's look at what the winds do this afternoon. So they pick up to over 25 miles per hour. And then even as we get into 8 p.m., 11 p.m. tonight, it still looks like we have those gusty winds. And then as we get into Saturday afternoon, remember, or Saturday morning, looks like it calms down again, kind of like what we're seeing right now. But then as we look at Saturday afternoon, remember this old one said don't have to worry about winds tomorrow, but Windy is calling for those winds to increase once again to 25 miles per hour, although I will say it doesn't look as widespread as today. So I would say winds in the forecast are a bit of a question mark there on Saturday. I'd say it's a guarantee that we're going to have that strong southerly flow throughout the day today. And what that means is it's basically, let's clean this map up a little bit. Well, now we'll keep structures on. Basically what that means is southerly winds are going to try to push this fire towards the north. So where we're seeing some activity right here, that's going to try to push it up here. But you notice not a lot of structures on this part of the fire. So that's actually going to be potentially beneficial for California net. Obviously, there are some structures in there, and hopefully they're doing some protection if they can. But that could actually provide some benefits to our ecosystem. I'd say the maybe still scary part of this forecast is with the southerly winds on this side, we actually did see them shift a bit more southwesterly yesterday afternoon, kind of aligning with some of the canyons that we have in here. So I think the area of this fire that I'm most worried about this afternoon is to see if it pushes into these fuels that, again, when we look at the fire history right there, haven't burnt in a very long time. So that's, I'd say, the most concerning part of the forecast right now is those southerly winds are still going to try to push this active part of the fire up that big Chico Creek Canyon into this area of fuel. I'd say if you want the silver lining, it's that those southerly winds aren't creating any real threat for Chico, it seems like. It's just going to continue to push the fire up, at least during the afternoon hours when it's the peak wildfire activity. When you get down canyon winds overnight, that's maybe something else. So again, always pay attention to evacuation warnings and orders. But those southerly winds are going to start to push it actually away from Forest Ranch. And that was a very close call that we had there yesterday. But again, I'm going to be watching that and just to see if it crosses 32 throughout the day today. Those, I'd say, are my big things that I'll be watching. And I'm going to try to do another update tonight, especially if things are changing. So you can stay updated for that. I'll also try to do one tomorrow morning, doing another update on whatever happens throughout the day today. So hopefully this video was helpful. I should probably say one more time, just pay attention to evacuation orders and warnings. And just thoughts and prayers go out to everybody who's potentially been impacted by this fire, especially the community of Cohasset. Again, just because the fire perimeter is over you doesn't mean you can't hold on to some hope that maybe it just passed around you. So yeah, hopefully this video helped. I'll have more details throughout all wildfire season. Thanks for watching.